I was trained to destroy what surfaced, not to keep it alive. The orders were clear, and the system favored certainty over restraint. When the boat circled empty and still breathing, the weight shifted to me. I chose to hold it together, knowing silence would judge the choice later. By the spring of 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic had entered a transitional phase. German U-boats were no longer operating with the freedom they had enjoyed earlier in the war, but they remained a persistent threat along critical sea lanes. Allied shipping moving between the United States, Africa, and Europe still faced attack, particularly in the eastern Atlantic and along the approaches to West Africa. The German submarine force, though reduced in numbers and effectiveness, continued patrols from bases in occupied France, relying on stealth, endurance, and occasional technological advantages to survive. On 4 June 1944, several hundred miles west of Cape Blanco, French West Africa, an American hunter-killer group moved slowly across open ocean. The weather was fair, with moderate seas and clear visibility. There was nothing unusual about the setting. The ships involved had been at sea for weeks, following a routine that had become familiar to the crews: search, listen, wait, and repeat. The task group was designated TG-22.3 and operated under the U.S. Navy's Atlantic Fleet. Its mission was not escort duty, but active pursuit. Rather than protecting a convoy, the group's purpose was to locate and destroy enemy submarines before they could reach shipping lanes. The formation was built around the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal, accompanied by 5 destroyer escorts: USS Chatelaine, Jenks, Pillsbury, Flaherty, and Pope. Together, they formed a mobile anti-submarine unit capable of sustained patrols far from shore. The commander of the group was Captain Daniel Vincent Gallery, an experienced naval aviator with a background in carrier operations. Gallery had been given a degree of operational latitude unusual for the time. His orders allowed him to adapt tactics in the field, provided the overall mission, neutralizing enemy submarines, was pursued. Under his command, the task group had already sunk several U-boats earlier in 1944, using coordinated air and surface attacks guided by sonar and radio intelligence. Daily life aboard the ships was methodical and restrained. Watches rotated every 4 hours. Sonar operators remained at their stations for long periods, headphones pressed tight, listening for faint mechanical sounds beneath the water. Pilots flew scheduled patrols from Guadalcanal, scanning the sea surface for periscopes, oil slicks, or unusual wave patterns. Engineers monitored engines and generators, maintaining a steady cruising speed that balanced fuel economy with readiness. The German submarine force operating in this region faced increasing difficulties. Allied radar, high-frequency direction finding, and improved escort tactics had narrowed the margins for error. Many U-boat commanders now spent most of their patrols submerged, conserving battery power and avoiding contact rather than seeking it. Radio transmissions were minimized, and patrol routes were adjusted frequently to avoid detection. Despite these constraints, German Naval Command continued to deploy submarines equipped with new or experimental systems. Some boats carried advanced acoustic torpedoes designed to home in on propeller noise. Others were fitted with improved radar detectors or snorkel devices intended to allow diesel operation while submerged. These developments were meant to counter Allied advantages, but they also introduced complexity and mechanical risk. One such submarine, U-505, was operating in the eastern Atlantic during this period. Commissioned in 1941, U-505 was a Type 9XC boat, larger than the more common Type VII submarines and capable of long-range patrols. By mid-1944, it had experienced a troubled service history. Mechanical failures, crew strain, and repeated encounters with Allied forces had eroded its effectiveness. Several patrols had ended prematurely due to equipment problems, and morale aboard the boat had suffered accordingly. The commander of U-505 at the time was Oberlieutenant Sergei Harold Lange. Lange was relatively young but had already endured multiple difficult patrols. His boat had survived depth charge attacks and prolonged chases, and it had returned to base more than once with damage that required extensive repair. Each patrol carried the expectation of attack, yet increasingly offered little opportunity to strike back. On the American side, Captain Gallery had grown frustrated with a recurring limitation of anti-submarine warfare. Most encounters ended with the destruction of the submarine and the loss of its crew. While this removed the immediate threat, it also eliminated the possibility of recovering intelligence from the vessel itself. Documents, code books, and equipment typically went down with the boat. Gallery was aware that earlier in the war, British forces had occasionally succeeded in boarding damaged U-boats, gaining valuable insight into German operations. These opportunities were rare, and official doctrine did not encourage attempts to capture a submarine at sea. Within TG 22.3, Gallery quietly considered the possibility of taking a U-boat intact if circumstances allowed. He understood the risks involved. A damaged submarine could sink without warning, scuttling charges might detonate, surviving crew could resist boarding. Nonetheless, he believed with proper preparation and discipline, a boarding attempt could be made under controlled conditions. This idea was not formalized in orders, nor was it discussed openly beyond a small circle of officers. The primary mission remained unchanged: locate and neutralize enemy submarines. Any additional action would depend on conditions that might never arise. In late May 1944, TG 22.3 shifted its patrol area slightly southward, responding to intelligence assessments suggesting renewed U-boat activity near the African approaches. The group maintained a steady patrol pattern, with destroyer escorts sweeping ahead of the carrier, while aircraft extended the search radius. On the morning of 4 June 1944, sonar contact was reported by USS Chatelaine. The signal was faint but consistent with a submerged submarine. Initial analysis suggested a target moving slowly, likely on battery power. The contact was passed to the task group commander and standard tracking procedures were initiated. Aircraft were launched to assist, and surface ships adjusted course to maintain contact. At this stage, there was nothing exceptional about the situation. Similar contacts had been made before, often resulting in hours of maneuvering without a confirmed attack. Submarines frequently slipped away by altering depth or course, exploiting thermal layers in the water to distort sonar readings. The American ships were trained to expect prolonged engagements with uncertain outcomes. As the tracking continued, sonar operators noted intermittent changes in the target's depth. These adjustments suggested a submarine attempting to evade rather than attack. No torpedo tracks were detected, and no periscope sightings were reported. The submarine appeared to be running quietly, avoiding aggressive maneuvers that might reveal its position. For Captain Gallery and his officers, the situation represented both routine and opportunity. The contact was firm enough to justify continued pursuit, but the lack of hostile action raised questions about the submarine's condition and intent. Was it conserving power? Was it damaged? Or was it waiting for a chance to strike? Orders were issued to maintain pressure without rushing the attack. Destroyer escorts took turns passing over the contact, dropping sonar buoys and making measured depth charge runs designed to force the submarine to maneuver. Aircraft remained overhead, ready to mark the position if the boat surfaced. Below the surface, aboard U-505, the situation was deteriorating. Battery power was limited, and the repeated sonar pings indicated a coordinated search. The crew worked quietly at their stations, monitoring gauges and listening to the muffled sounds of explosions in the distance. Each depth charge run imposed strain on the hull and on the men inside. The engagement had not yet reached a decisive phase. Both sides were operating within familiar constraints, following established procedures. Yet subtle factors, mechanical fatigue, crew endurance, and command decisions were beginning to narrow the range of possible outcomes. As the afternoon progressed, the American ships maintained contact, adjusting speed and formation to keep the submarine boxed in. No single action stood out, and no dramatic escalation occurred. Instead, the encounter settled into a sustained test of endurance and judgment, with neither side fully aware how it would conclude. The task group continued its measured pursuit as daylight wore on, the operational situation unchanged in appearance, but steadily tightening beneath the surface. By the early afternoon of 4 June 1944, Task Group 22.3 had established sustained contact with the submerged submarine. The engagement remained controlled and deliberate. Captain Gallery did not order an immediate full attack. Instead, he directed his destroyer escorts to maintain steady pressure, rotating their sonar sweeps to prevent fatigue among operators and to deny the submarine any prolonged window to maneuver freely. USS Chatelaine continued to hold the primary contact, while USS Jenks and USS Pillsbury adjusted their positions to block likely escape routes. The ships operated at moderate speed, careful not to overwhelm sonar returns with their own propeller noise. Aircraft from Guadalcanal circled above, maintaining visual coverage of the sea surface and standing ready to drop smoke markers if the submarine surfaced. The tactical approach reflected lessons learned over several years of anti-submarine warfare. Sudden, aggressive depth charge attacks often drove submarines deeper and made them harder to track. A slower, methodical pattern designed to exhaust batteries and strain crew endurance had proven more effective. The goal was not immediate destruction, but gradual containment. Below the surface, U-505's situation worsened incrementally. The submarine's electric motors operated under increasing strain as battery levels declined. Attempts to change depth were met with renewed sonar contact and corrective maneuvers by the American ships above. The crew worked in near silence, speaking only when necessary. Internal temperatures rose as ventilation remained limited, and condensation formed along the steel bulkheads. Mechanical issues compounded the pressure. U-505 had suffered persistent technical problems throughout its service life, and this patrol was no exception. Reports from the engine room indicated irregular readings in the electrical systems. While not immediately catastrophic, these anomalies reduced confidence in the boat's ability to sustain prolonged submerged operation. Oberleutnant Sir Harold Lang faced a narrowing set of options. Surfacing risked immediate detection and attack from aircraft. Remaining submerged meant continued battery depletion and the possibility of losing propulsion altogether. Radio silence prevented calling for assistance, and nearby friendly forces were unlikely to intervene in time, even if a message could be sent. As the American ships continued their sweep, depth charges were deployed sparingly. The explosions were calculated to be disruptive rather than destructive, intended to force course changes and consume battery power. Each detonation reverberated through the submarine's hull, dislodging equipment and increasing stress among the crew. Minor leaks developed, requiring constant attention from damage control teams. On the surface, officers aboard the American ships began to recognize patterns in the submarine's behavior. Sonar reports suggested limited vertical movement and reduced speed. The target was no longer attempting sharp, evasive turns. Instead, it appeared to be maintaining a shallow depth, adjusting course only when pressure became too intense. Captain Gallery reviewed these reports with interest. The submarine's responses were consistent with a vessel operating under constraint rather than confidence. Gallery ordered continued restraint. He instructed his ships to avoid actions that might force an emergency surfacing or catastrophic damage. The objective remained containment. This approach was not without risk. A submarine, even under pressure, could still launch torpedoes if it found an opportunity. The destroyer escorts maintained readiness for evasive maneuvers, and lookouts were posted continuously. Despite the lack of hostile actions so far, no assumptions were made about the enemy's intent. As the afternoon progressed, the engagement entered its fifth hour. Crew fatigue became a factor on both sides. Sonar operators rotated out for brief rest periods. Pilots landed and were replaced by fresh crews. On U-505, the strain was more severe. Battery indicators dropped steadily, and the boat's ability to maintain depth control degraded. The smell of diesel fuel and oil mixed with stale air, adding to discomfort. At approximately 1300 hours, a brief opportunity appeared for the submarine. Sonar contact weakened momentarily as thermal conditions shifted. Lang ordered a slight course change, attempting to slip out of the containment pattern. For several minutes, the submarine's noise signature became less distinct. The American ships responded quickly. USS Flaherty adjusted course to close the suspected escape vector, while Chatelaine reacquired contact within a short interval. The maneuver had failed to break free, and the submarine was once again confined. This exchange confirmed to Gallery that the submarine's margin for error was shrinking. He continued to resist the impulse to escalate. Depth charge patterns remained measured. Aircraft maintained altitude rather than diving aggressively on the contact. By mid-afternoon, signs of distress aboard U-505 became more pronounced. Battery power approached critical levels. Internal communications reported difficulty maintaining propulsion at required speeds. The submarine's trim grew unstable, requiring constant adjustment of ballast tanks. Each correction consumed additional power. Lang convened his senior officers briefly in the control room. Options were discussed in practical terms. Surfacing under controlled conditions might allow the crew to abandon ship, but it would almost certainly result in capture or destruction. Remaining submerged risked losing propulsion altogether, which could lead to an uncontrolled ascent or sinking. German naval doctrine emphasized scuttling in the event of capture to prevent enemy intelligence gains. Demolition charges were installed aboard U-505 for this purpose. However, activating them required time and coordination. The crew would need to abandon ship promptly to avoid casualties. On the American side, the engagement continued to follow established procedures. No attempt was made to force a rapid conclusion. Gallery monitored developments from the bridge of Guadalcanal, aware that prolonged pressure increased the likelihood of a surfacing event. He had not issued any orders regarding boarding, nor had he discussed such actions with the broader task group. As daylight began to wane, the operational picture remained stable but tense. The submarine was contained, its capabilities diminishing. The American ships held their positions, conserving ammunition and fuel. Aircraft prepared to maintain coverage into the evening. Shortly after 1600 hours, sonar operators reported changes consistent with loss of depth control. The submarine's depth fluctuated more erratically, and its speed decreased further. These indicators suggested that battery exhaustion was imminent. Gallery acknowledged the reports and ordered all ships to maintain readiness. He did not alter the overall plan. The situation was approaching a decision point, but no abrupt action was taken. Below the surface, U-505's crew worked to stabilize the boat, but the effort consumed the last reserves of power. The possibility of remaining submerged was rapidly disappearing. The operational choices had narrowed to a single outcome, though its precise form remained uncertain. The engagement, prolonged and restrained, had exposed the limits of endurance and doctrine on both sides. Neither force had acted outside established procedures, yet the cumulative effect of pressure and constraint was driving events towards an irreversible phase.
By late afternoon on 4 June 1944, the engagement reached a decisive transition, not through a single dramatic action, but through accumulated limitation. U-505 could no longer sustain submerged operations. Battery levels had fallen to a point where propulsion and depth control were unreliable. Internal systems showed cascading failures, and the submarine's trim became increasingly unstable. At approximately 1700 hours, Oberleutnant Sir C. Harold Lang made a decision shaped less by doctrine than by immediate necessity. Remaining submerged risked a loss of control that could trap the crew inside a sinking vessel. Surfacing under pressure offered a narrow chance for survival, even if capture or destruction was likely. Orders were given quietly. The submarine began a controlled ascent. On the surface, lookouts aboard USS Chatelaine were the first to spot the conning tower breaking through the water. The submarine surfaced at a distance of roughly 700 yards, listing slightly and moving at low speed. Within seconds, the American ships shifted from tracking to engagement posture. Guns were trained, and aircraft overhead adjusted their positions. U-505 did not fire torpedoes. Instead, its deck gun crew made no attempt to man their weapon. White water poured from vents along the hull as the boat completed its surfacing. The conning tower hatch opened, and German crewmen began emerging, some with hands raised, others moving with urgency toward the deck. Captain Gallery observed the scene from Guadalcanal. He noted several critical details almost immediately. The submarine was still moving forward under its own power. No scuttling explosions had occurred. Crew members were abandoning the vessel rapidly, suggesting either severe internal damage or an expectation that the boat would be destroyed imminently. Standard procedure called for continued fire until the submarine was sunk. Indeed, USS Chatelaine opened fire with its deck gun, and aircraft strafed the submarine's deck to prevent manning of weapons. These actions were brief and controlled. Within minutes, the German crew had jumped overboard or slid down lines into the water. Then, an unusual condition became apparent. Despite the crew abandoning ship, U-505 did not sink. It continued moving slowly in a wide circle, engines still turning. No visible signs of flooding beyond normal surfacing discharge were observed. The conning tower remained intact, and the hull showed no catastrophic damage. This moment presented Captain Gallery with an operational choice that lay outside routine doctrine. A live enemy submarine, apparently intact and unmanned, remained on the surface. Such circumstances were rare. Most U-boats, once abandoned, sank quickly due to scuttling charges or flooding. U-505 did neither. Gallery had anticipated this possibility in theory, but not in detail. He had quietly instructed a small boarding party weeks earlier, selecting volunteers from Guadalcanal and drilling them on basic procedures. These preparations had not been formally authorized, nor had they been tested under combat conditions. The men involved understood that the opportunity might never arise. As reports came in confirming that the submarine was still underway and not sinking, Gallery assessed the risks. Scuttling charges could still be active. The boat could submerge unexpectedly. Trapped crew members might resist, yet the potential intelligence value of capturing a German submarine intact was significant. Gallery issued an order that diverged from standard practice. He directed USS Pillsbury to prepare a boarding party. The objective was limited: secure the submarine, prevent scuttling if possible, and assess whether it could be taken under tow. There was no expectation of extended combat aboard the vessel. Lieutenant Albert David, the young officer aboard Pillsbury, was assigned to lead the boarding party. David had no prior experience boarding submarines, nor did any member of his team. Their training was theoretical and brief. They were equipped with small arms, flashlights, and basic tools. As Pillsbury maneuvered alongside the still circling U-505, American sailors in the water were being recovered, along with German survivors. The Germans were exhausted, many injured, and offered no resistance. None indicated that scuttling charges had been detonated, though this could not be confirmed. At approximately 17:30 hours, David and his men crossed onto the deck of the submarine. The surface was wet and cluttered with loose equipment. No German crew remained aboard. The conning tower hatch stood open. Inside, the submarine was dark and oppressive. Electrical power was intermittent. Water seeped through fittings, and the smell of diesel and oil was strong. The boarding party moved quickly, following their limited instructions: locate and disable scuttling charges, secure documents, and assess flooding. They worked under extreme uncertainty. German submarines were known to carry demolition charges set to detonate after abandonment. These could be triggered by timers or pressure switches. Every step carried the risk of explosion. David's team split into small groups, each tasked with specific objectives. One group descended toward the control room, where valves and switches were located. Another moved toward the radio room and captain's quarters, areas likely to contain documents.
A third remained topside to monitor conditions and maintain communication with Pillsbury. Within minutes, the boarding party discovered that scuttling procedures had been initiated but not completed. Valves were open, allowing water into certain compartments, but demolition charges had not detonated. Some charges were found wired but inactive. The reasons for this incomplete scuttling were not immediately clear. The boarding party acted decisively. Valves were closed where possible. Flooding was slowed but not entirely stopped. The submarine's engines were still turning slowly, contributing to its circular motion. David ordered the engines stopped to stabilize the vessel. As this work progressed, Captain Gallery monitored developments closely. He understood that every minute increased risk, but also increased the chance of success. He ordered additional personnel to stand by, but did not flood the submarine with boarders. The priority was control, not occupation. By early evening, U-505 was no longer moving under its own power. Flooding had been reduced to manageable levels. The submarine remained afloat, damaged but stable. The decision to board had shifted the nature of the engagement. What had begun as a routine anti-submarine hunt had become an improvised operation requiring judgment beyond established doctrine. The risks were now personal, borne by a small group of sailors inside an enemy vessel far from shore. The outcome of that decision was still uncertain, but the immediate danger had not yet passed.
As evening settled over the Atlantic on 4 June 1944, the situation shifted from immediate combat to sustained risk management. U-505 was afloat and no longer maneuvering, but it remained unstable. Flooding had been reduced, not eliminated. Internal compartments were still taking on water at a slow rate, and electrical systems functioned only intermittently. The submarine's survival now depended on continuous intervention. Lieutenant Albert David and his boarding party remained inside the vessel. Their actions were cautious and systematic. They continued to search for additional scuttling charges, moving compartment by compartment. German submarines were designed with multiple redundant methods of self-destruction, and it could not be assumed that all had been identified. Each valve, switch, and wiring run was treated as potentially hazardous. The physical environment inside U-505 imposed severe limitations. Lighting was poor. Air circulation was minimal. Water pooled on the deck plates, making footing uncertain. The submarine's internal layout was unfamiliar to the American sailors, increasing the risk of error. Communication with the surface was restricted to shouted reports and intermittent radio contact. Above, Captain Gallery faced growing pressure from operational realities. Nightfall would complicate towing operations and increase the risk of renewed flooding. Weather conditions remained favorable, but even moderate seas could overwhelm a damaged submarine under tow. Additionally, the longer U-505 remained afloat, the greater the chance that a German distress signal might have been transmitted earlier, potentially drawing other submarines into the area. Gallery ordered USS Chatelaine to attempt an initial tow connection. The operation was complex. Lines had to be passed to the submarine, secured to appropriate points on the hull, and tensioned carefully to avoid structural failure. The submarine's damaged state made the process slower than anticipated. Inside U-505, David's team continued to stabilize critical systems. They reported that the submarine's rudder was jammed, contributing to its earlier circular motion. Temporary measures were taken to lock it in a neutral position. Pumps were brought online where possible to control flooding. These actions required improvisation, as American sailors were unfamiliar with German equipment and labeling. As the tow attempt progressed, concerns arose among senior officers. The longer the operation continued, the more it diverged from standing orders. Official doctrine emphasized destruction of enemy submarines, not recovery. Gallery was aware that his decision to board and tow U-505 could be questioned, especially if the operation failed or resulted in American casualties. Radio communications were carefully controlled. Gallery limited transmissions to essential operational traffic, avoiding unnecessary reports that might alert higher command prematurely.
He understood that success would justify explanation more effectively than speculation. By nightfall, the tow line was secured and USS Chatelaine began moving at low speed. The submarine responded, remaining afloat and aligned behind the destroyer escort. The task group adjusted formation to protect the slow-moving vessels. Inside the submarine, the boarding party prepared for extended occupation. Watches were established, flooding levels were monitored continuously. The men worked in shifts, balancing vigilance with exhaustion. The risk of delayed scuttling charges remained, though none had detonated. As the night wore on, no new threats materialized. The sea remained calm. The submarine held together under tow. What had been an extraordinary gamble was beginning to resemble a controlled operation, though the margin for error remained narrow. Captain Gallery understood that the most dangerous phase was not yet over. The submarine had been secured, but its ultimate fate and the institutional response to the decision that made this possible remained unresolved.
By the morning of 5 June 1944, Task Group 22.3 had maintained control of U-505 for more than 12 hours. The submarine remained under tow, afloat but fragile. Flooding was contained at manageable levels, and no additional scuttling charges had detonated. The boarding party, exhausted but alert, continued to monitor the vessel's condition. Captain Gallery now faced a new phase of responsibility, preserving secrecy. The capture of an enemy submarine intact carried immense intelligence value, but only if the Germans remained unaware that it had occurred. If German command learned that U-505 had been taken rather than sunk, they could assume that codes, documents, and equipment had been compromised and respond accordingly. Gallery issued strict orders. All German survivors were isolated and denied information. The task group maintained radio silence regarding the nature of the engagement. Official reports described the submarine as sunk, consistent with standard outcomes. Even within the American fleet, knowledge of the capture was tightly controlled. As the group proceeded toward Bermuda, the practical challenges of towing continued. Speed remained low. Escorts rotated positions to guard against potential attack. The boarding party was reinforced gradually, and additional efforts were made to stabilize the submarine for the longer journey. When the task group reached Bermuda on 19 June 1944, U-505 was transferred to U.S. Navy control under conditions of exceptional secrecy. The submarine was placed in a secure dockyard area. German prisoners were moved to isolated facilities where they were held without access to outside communication for the remainder of the war. This measure was taken to preserve the deception that U-505 had been lost at sea. Intelligence teams moved quickly. They recovered codebooks, operational orders, technical manuals, and equipment from the submarine. Among the items were materials related to German torpedo technology and radio procedures. These findings were shared selectively with Allied intelligence organizations, including those responsible for naval cryptanalysis. While the capture did not alter the overall course of the war, it contributed to a clearer understanding of German naval capabilities during a critical period. The institutional response to Captain Gallery's decision was measured but restrained. Officially, the operation was classified, limiting recognition. Privately, senior naval leadership acknowledged the value of the capture and the judgment exercised under uncertainty. Gallery's deviation from doctrine was not punished, but it was not publicly celebrated during the war. Lieutenant Albert David received the Medal of Honor for his leadership during the boarding operation. Several other members of the boarding party were awarded commendations. Their actions were cited for courage, initiative, and discipline under hazardous conditions. These recognitions were issued without public explanation of the operation's full significance. After the war, U-505 was eventually transported to the United States and preserved. Rather than being scrapped, it was placed on public display, where it remains as a rare surviving example of a German submarine captured at sea. For decades, many details of its capture remained classified, known only to those directly involved. The episode stands as an example of restrained initiative within a rigid system.
It was not defined by dramatic confrontation, but by careful observation, accumulated pressure, and a willingness to act when circumstances briefly allowed. The men involved operated within limits of equipment, doctrine, and endurance, and accepted personal risk without expectation of recognition. In the larger record of the war, the capture of U-505 occupies a quiet place. It did not produce a decisive battle or a sweeping strategic shift. Instead, it demonstrated how opportunity, discipline, and judgment could intersect in an otherwise routine operation, leaving a legacy measured more in knowledge preserved than enemies destroyed.